is adoption of the minutes from our meeting of January 20th. And do I have a motion to adopt the minutes? Michael,
Yeah.
second. Martin, all in favor? And that's adopted as well. Let's see, I have printed all of the minutes. The third item of the minutes. Hang on, maybe I have it here. Otherwise, I'll pull it up on the screen. Bear with me a moment. Tonight's agenda. So item 3 is public comments. Kathy's, looks like Kathy's connecting, but has not connected yet. And as she may wish to speak to, now it's item, it's item 4. Daniel, which item is it then?
Yeah, it's item 4.1, so it's like the next item on the agenda.
Right.
So we could skip a.
Why don't we switch things around? Is everyone acceptable with that? Or we could talk about the secondary suite size first? Or is that going to take too long?
We could do the business license one, might be shorter. We could do that one.
Sure. All right.
Yeah.
Good. Well, let's move to move item 4.3, and we'll put it in place for 4.1. And this is business license year-end report. And Daniel, do you want to take the lead on this?
Sure. So this is just, we provided the year-end report. I'll start sharing to council for information, and council referred it to a number of committees just for sort of background information on our business license program, licensing in particular the short-term rental piece of it. So in 2021, the municipality issued licenses to 504 businesses, and so up from 315 in 2019. But I think this reflects more, I would say, like our expanded reach of the business license bylaw rather than increase the number of businesses operating on Bowen. In particular, we've seen big increases in contractors and non-resident businesses, and in particular those associated with building activities on Bowen. And staff, we've been more sort of persistent in requiring business licenses as part of building permit reviews for contractors and subcontractors associated with the building. And then the other main piece that I presented to council and I'm presenting to committees is just telling council about and committees that we've hired a monitoring company called Hamari that monitors short-term rental listings on Bowen Island. So they monitor Airbnb and a number of other platforms, and they work to identify the listings based on the information available in the listing. And they provide that to us as a record, and they provide things like records of reviews for places. So if we contact somebody and they say, oh, I took it down, I'm no longer listing this, I'm not running the Airbnb anymore, we can point and we can say, well, you had reviews from a week ago and you had reviews from a month ago, and it looks like you're actively having guests still. So they provide this this dashboard of the stats on rentals on Bowen as they see it. So they've identified 127 active listings. It's hard to equate one-to-one to our licenses because that can be people renting multiple rooms. So they may have a bed and breakfast that can have 4 or 5 rooms in our land use bylaw, and that would be counted as 4 or 5 separate active listings, whereas we would include it in one business license. But as of February 28th, when I updated this, we had 22 listings that were not identified in early February, and 12 of them were subsequently identified and notified last week of the need for business licensing. So it's an ongoing thing that we monitor, but we are actively, identifying listings and notifying them of the need for business licenses. Hamari does things like it tracks listings over time. So it shows And it's a little bit hard, kind of gauge what our baseline is with all the COVID activity and everything that's going on. So you can see sort of through 2020, a flatter number of listings, then a sharp, the climb through 2021 into 2022 is maybe as COVID has receded enough that's made, Airbnb more possible. And you see this as well. They list what they forecast is the revenue that took place in short-term rentals on Bowen. So you see, that high of almost $1 million in revenue in 2019, and then the sort of the crash in 2020 with COVID and slight increase in 2021. And then this last piece is, I think, relevant just to the short-term rental. So this is the 2021 census numbers that have just come out. And so that lists the population on Bowen, the number of private dwellings, the number of private dwellings occupied by usual resident. So that's where the private dwelling that Census Canada identifies is occupied by the homeowner or by a tenant, but by a permanent resident, as opposed to ones that are not occupied by usual resident. And what we saw from 2016 to 2021 is the percent of dwellings occupied by usual resident went up from 78 to almost 85% of our dwellings are now occupied by the usual resident. Or it means that, instead of in 2016, we had 420 dwellings that were not occupied by usual resident, and that's decreased to 312 now in the 2021 census. So it's sort of one of the things that we track when looking at what's the impact of short-term rental on Bowen is just that number. I have then on this presentation a number of other data that the Hamari provides, and we'll include it then in the agenda going forward, but I'm open for questions at this point on just business licensing on Bowen.
I do have a question, since we're a planning commission. What does this tell us about planning, or how can this guide our planning? Or is it just
I think
interesting?
Yeah, I mean,
it is interesting.
I mean, I think, like I've done this presentation now for the Housing Advisory Committee that was most interested in the short-term rental impact. Probably the Community Economic Development Committee I'll present to, and they're sort of looking at overall, the stats of business licensing. So I don't think there's like an active thing before the Advisory Planning Commission that this, directly relates to. It's sort of just background knowledge.
Is this, do you think this is a trend that more and more people are becoming full-time residents on the island, or was this kind of a one-off, we hit a new plateau?
I mean, that's that's probably the big question going forward. Is it trend, or is it, is it COVID blip that's made more people live on Bowen because they don't have to do the commute, and in 2 years people will be back having to go to the office, and the commute from Bowen becomes less attractive? I think is a big question.
I guess we'll just wait and see.
Yeah.
The implications are interesting because it's, there's more demand for services on the island and all kinds of other things, right? So it's there can be, or there's potentially broad sweeping kind of implications for having that increase in growth.
Yeah, like I know in the latest census numbers, I was getting messages from other planners in Metro Vancouver saying that they had bet on which would be the fastest growing community in the census, and it was Bowen, and they said nobody put Bowen in the pool. And but in terms of looking at our growth, essentially half our growth came from new dwellings and half our growth came from that change of dwellings that were not occupied by usual resident to become occupied by usual resident.
Right. I think you spoke with planners in Vancouver. I gather that the trend there is the opposite, that there are less people living full-time in Vancouver.
Yeah.
For, again, multiple reasons. Okay, well, thank you, Daniel, for that. Is there any other questions from the commission about this item? Let us move back all the way to item 3, which is public comments. I see that we now have Ian and Kathy with us. We're going to be discussing the Arbutus Ridge amendment to the land use bylaw next, and I don't know whether either of you wish to speak regarding that item.
I don't know. Can you hear me or?
We can hear you, yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, we had originally went for rezoning of the property, expecting, we have a 10-acre parcel.
Mhm.
Lost you, Ian.
Perhaps Ian can't even hear that we're saying that we've lost him.
Okay, yeah, I guess we just kind of found out last year that we didn't have that zoning because we were originally going with Allard's. Sorry, I have dogs. We were originally going with that whole development, and it was just taking so long. So we just decided to go by ourselves. And we didn't realize we had lost the zoning because they never wanted it, I guess, at the time that they went for it. So I guess we're just trying to get it back. Because I know our oldest son wants to buy one of our lots, and hopefully he's going to build a nice little cottage that I can live in when I sell my house.
Right.
So that's the plan.
Okay. Thank you, Kathy. Daniel, this item came to the commission back in, I think it was November, was it?
Yeah.
Yes. And so can you bring us up to speed here? There have been some developments since then. It looks as if there was an assessment done for wastewater treatment plants or septic, and also that there has been the entire parcel is not being addressed at this point.
Yeah, so I just have a presentation I'll show you. And yeah, there was a change from this when you last considered it to the overall rezoning application. So this is, yeah, RZ03 2020. And specific for this is 1676 Malkin Creek Road, which is shown here highlighted there in the ortho. So the big change was that this came to council in January. So you had seen the rezoning application for the entire Arbutus Ridge comprehensive development zone to allow the accessory residential use. It went to a number of committees, including the King Edward Bay Water Committee, and that committee recommended to council to not proceed with the portion of the rezoning that was within the King Edward Bay water system until progress had been made on an agreement on the overall West Side system water systems. And so based on that recommendation from the committee, council at the meeting essentially split the rezoning and directed staff not to proceed with the portion of the rezoning that was within the King Edward Bay water system. I'll just go to my next slide. This may show up better. So the majority of that CD18 zone, the large parcel, sits within the King Edward Bay water system. So council directed staff not to proceed with that portion, but to proceed with the portion of the rezoning application that is the 1676 Malkin Creek Road as the parent parcel that has zoning to become 4 lots. It falls outside the King Edward Bay water system and will be serviced by private wells. And so that was the direction from council, was to proceed with this part and put the rest on hold until there's been more progress on West Side Water as a whole. So that was that motion from council in January, I believe. So just by way of background, this is the CD18 zone. Area 1 permits detached dwelling, doesn't permit accessory residential use. And so as Kathy had said, for these applicants in particular, they in that CD18 zone, they gained zoning permission to divide 1676 Malkin Creek Road into 4 properties. And when they came to subdivide and receive their PLR, the approving officer at the time noted that you didn't have permission to build secondary suites, it's not in the zoning, and that was news for them, and they subsequently applied to rezone to essentially bring that permission into their zoning. There's a number of
How
other.
large, sorry, how large are those 4 parcels going to be?
Sure. So this is the proposed subdivision plan. So you see a range in sizes. So that
Alright.
lot 1 is about 2 hectares down to lot 3 is about just above a third of a hectare. It looks like 0.36. And then lot 5 shown here is actually the park dedication. So it'll count 5 lots, but one of them is park and 4 fee simple lots.
So all of them are large enough to meet the minimum lot requirements for a secondary dwelling.
Correct. There's other zoning regulations that would remain in effect. There's a maximum lot coverage, a maximum floor area, and a maximum number of accessory buildings. And so staff drafted and council gave first reading to amendment bylaw 562. So it would create a new area 4 for this CD zone that would affect this lot, or this to be 4 lots that would add accessory residential use as a permitted accessory use. It would specify in area 4, the maximum floor area of 260 square meters would include the accessory residential use. And then it makes a number of minor border adjustments to CD 18 to reflect the actual subdivisions of the lots to date.
So just a point of clarification on that item 2. So the total floor area permitted on our lot then is 260 square meters.
Yeah, excluding
correct?
garages in the zoning.
Okay. All right. So so the dwelling unit plus the secondary accessory would total 260 square meters.
Yeah.
Does that would that permit one to potentially have a larger secondary suite than would otherwise be allowed?
It would still be regulated by the detached secondary suite, which max is at 115 square meters.
Okay, so that still applies. Okay.
Yeah. And then on the smaller lots shown, it would be a smaller amount, because I think that 115 square meters max is when you're a 2-acre lot size. It's based on a % of lot area. And so if you're smaller than 2 acres, you end up with a smaller amount than the 115 square meters. Yeah, so that was, I'll stop sharing there for a discussion.
All right. Thank you, Daniel. Does the commission have any comments or questions?
I guess my question is, frankly, I don't see an issue here.
Right.
Am I wrong? That might be an issue in itself.
That's certainly a question now, isn't it?
Daniel, is I mean, it looks like they're, to use a term of legal art, everything is tickety-boo.
Except for our neighbors. It's
Oh, yeah.
another issue.
I've heard the rumors.
Oh, no. Yeah.
Yeah, what is the issue?
I mean, we are in a public council meeting. I don't know,
Oh,
or committee meeting.
sorry.
I don't know how much you want to.
Yeah. Well, we have an easement that goes through 2 of our neighbors. So
Yeah, I
I know
noticed-
Easement or
an easement,
a road easement or a what?
Yes.
What easement? Okay.
road
Yeah.
easement.
Yeah,
So
I-
everyone has to drive by the 2 homes.
Yeah, I see that one of the lots doesn't seem to have access from Malkin Road right? One of the proposed lots.
That's the way it looks. Yeah.
Yeah, so we've sent notice out. We're having a public open house next week with the. So we've sent notice to the neighbors and we've advertised in the paper, and we'll be, collecting any feedback. We haven't received any feedback on the rezoning so far, but we'll bring that to council. Yeah, when we come for second reading.
Well, I would say from my perspective, it's fine if the neighbors, if you know, I don't see a problem with it.
I don't either.
I don't see a problem with it, notwithstanding the neighbors.
So we would say that the APC supports bylaw 562. It's like
In
a
Yes,
short, yep.
I think that's correct.
Yeah.
Do we have a motion to that effect that you've already drafted their stuff?
I can just take what I have and say that the commission supports what's in the agenda, but I'll remove provide comments and replace that with supports. Is that okay?
How that works, I think.
So that the advisory planning commission support Arbutus Ridge, land use bylaw number 57, amendment bylaw number 562, 2002, RZ 03, 2020, area 1 of CD 11, Ian Stuart and Allard Ockeloen.
Yeah, correct. So do I have a mover? Kirsty, second. Michael. Any further discussion? All in favor? We are unanimous. Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Bye.
Okay. And so then moving on to item 4.2, which is the detached secondary suite minimum lot size review, which is somehow related to the previous.
Yeah,
This is the
it's handy how
This
it
is the
works
order
out.
it's coming in.
Yeah.
So again, Daniel, maybe you want to give us a little bit of your comments on this. I have a question, but it's a math question.
Okay. So by way of background, in bylaw 414 2016, which I think was adopted in 2017, the municipality permitted detached secondary suites. So essentially that second smaller dwelling on a lot, and we permitted it with a minimum lot size of 0.36 hectares, which is about 9/10 of an acre. Based on recommendations from the Housing Advisory Committee, at a committee of the whole in October, council recommended to staff a number of housing related actions, but they sort of gave the highest priority to this: encourage more secondary suites, research potential of reducing lot size for secondary suites. So as a first step in that process, what staff have done is done just sort of a quick analysis on sizes of residential lots on Bowen to identify how many are currently large enough for detached secondary suites and what would be the impact of reducing that lot size. And we brought that to council, and council then referred it out to the Advisory Planning Commission and the Housing Advisory Committee for initial feedback before considering any further action. So in essence, when we broke it down, and I'll give the caveat in terms of our GIS data has a lot of sort of, challenges working with it. So we've identified these number of properties, but probably you delve into the numbers, you'd say, well, some of these lots are actually common property or some are not, so I don't want to get too hung up on the exact number, but I'm confident in them in terms of the scope and the general direction. But in general, it's about a third of the properties on Bowen are large enough that they can already house a detached secondary suite. So we show here 888 large enough to have a detached secondary suite. And then we broke it down into sort of 4 further, bucket sizes of lots to see what's the impact of going down. And thinking going down to, if we went down to 0.2 is a half acre lot size, what would the impact of that be? And then going smaller. And so you can see sort of it's roughly about another third in between 0.36 and 0.15 hectares, and then about another third are smaller than 0.15 hectares. And then when we sort of mapped out where that is across the island, it's interesting that, within existing neighborhoods, there's sort of a big range from this map. It's like yellow is large enough to have a detached secondary suite. And then the various shades of yellow or sort of orange to red are as they decrease in size, and then blue is then that further smaller size. And that's in this Seven Hills Miller's Landing area. again, so it's sort of a dispersed impact of permitting different sizes. There's no one area would say, well, now this area will definitely be allowed detached secondary suites or not. And then we just flagged in the staff report, there'd be other considerations to take into effect. So, I mean, water capacity, we know challenges we're having with water and sewer, I guess, so servicing capacity in general. Would it need to be reviewed other density provisions on smaller lots? And finally, especially, we currently have development permit guidelines for detached secondary suites, but they're fairly loose and fairly permissive. And then, okay, if it's allowed on significantly smaller lots, would that need to be more considered? So it's more sort of directive and say, as you get smaller, you need to be more looking like, laneway house development permit guidelines, where they're a little more restrictive and directive in terms of where windows are looking and how you're impacting the neighbors. So that's essentially what I brought to council, and then looking really for advisory planning commission comments at this point.
So our current area limit for detached secondary suites is 115 square meters, correct?
The current maximum size?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, and that's measured to the inside face of walls or the outside face of walls, less the thickness of the wall.
It's now measured to the inside of the wall.
Okay. That's funny, other way that they sometimes do.
Sorry, I'm not very good at meters. About how many square feet is that?
It's like 1,200 or 1,250.
Actually
It's-
pretty easy.
it-
Just
it's-
multiply it by 10.
Yeah, you get pretty close if you multiply
Close
by
enough.
10.
I
So-
have trouble with hectares, but I've been working that out here. 2.5 acres per hectare, right?
Yes, what you need is one of these, Michael.
Oh.
It's a metric converter. Yeah, this only does metric conversions. It's fantastic. It can add and subtract. It can add and subtract.
I thought the most interesting thing about the presentation, Daniel, was the map that showed the lot sizes and the geographical location on the island. I was a bit frustrated that it was so small. I would have really liked to have dug in for the detail, but more for information rather than. But that is fascinating, because what we learn is that different lot sizes are spread out almost randomly when you get out of the Miller's Landing, Kate's Hill area, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure what that means.
Although there appears to be a predominance of large lots, but of course, because they're large lots, they take more land mass.
I guess that's right. Yeah, 0.36 hectares that's the classic 10-acre.
Well, 0.36 hectares is 9/10 of an acre. So anything we think
Yeah,
of as
okay,
like
so
a
that's
rural
the-
lot probably is yellow.
That's the current limit, right? If I remember.
Well,
And then some of that gets skewed because it captures things like the parent parcels. So like the Grafton Lake area, gets captured as yellow, but it's intended to be subdivided to create more lots.
Oh,
Or
yeah. Well, I mean, some of these parcels are actually 50, 60 acres, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
so if the desire of the OCP is to have, well, I don't necessarily agree with it, but that all this development should happen in Snug Cove and near the ferry and this and that, and on bus routes. That's where most of these small lots are. So if we want people to live and they can ride the bus instead of drive their cars, then all of these small lots are gonna, be the areas that people, additional residences are gonna be, I guess, wanted. And so if we don't lower the lot size for additional residences, then we're not gonna get them anywhere that's particularly useful for a rental accommodation or, additional family members or whatever.
Yeah, further to that, there's probably a lot of non-compliance in the lots that are not allowing this, the lot sizes currently, which are, they're used as secondary suites. I can probably think of some examples, which I will not name, but
I mean, I remember looking at the work that was done when Bowen first adopted a secondary suite bylaw. And at the time it was considering it as a secondary suite and detached secondary suite, and ultimately just the secondary suite piece passed. And there was work done by, I believe it was then the Advisory Planning Commission, essentially going into neighborhoods to try to survey, what the number of existing secondary suites were, and doing some work looking at other communities. And I believe the findings were essentially that like the number of secondary suites in a community didn't vary a whole lot if they were permitted or not. So like places that legalized it, places that didn't, really it was like the market was driving demand for that secondary suite market. And by legalizing it, you sort of mean that it's more likely it's going to meet code and it's going to be a livable place and slightly more above board and a little more secure, but it didn't actually vary the number of secondary suites a whole lot.
Yeah, I think that water and septic are going to be the boundaries of how many secondary suites. I think that should drive it more than lot size personally, and I think that's going to be fairly constraining in many areas, especially the cove.
So it's interesting. So as it happens, I was involved with a project recently on Salt Spring. Salt Spring has a trigger mechanism in their bylaw where, should you wish to build a detached secondary suite or renovate and add on to an existing detached residential suite, you must install a rainwater harvesting system. That they go hand in hand. So I don't know if you've looked into that at all, Daniel, but it might be worth a chat with their planning department to see how that's working. I know that there's sort of friends of friends that I was speaking with, that was actually a consideration for them whether they would go ahead or not because of the costs associated with the rainwater harvesting system. I also recognize that rainwater harvesting, it doesn't solve all the problems because when you need the water most, there's no rain. Nevertheless, it's an attempt to try to mitigate that particular concern. Do you happen to know off the top of your head, Daniel, the size of detached secondary suites in Vancouver?
No, I don't.
In Vancouver, it has some profound differences from Bowen. One of the main ones being that there are a lot of lanes, and secondary suites are often accessed by the lane. But the secondary suites are permitted on most conventional Vancouver lots, which are about 50 by 120 feet, which is 0.06 of a hectare. So a sixth the size of what our minimum lot size is currently, which is kind of interesting.
They also don't need septic fields, just for.
They don't. And I guess that is a question now. One of the things that when we first looked at detached secondary suites, there was some impetus on by council to be able to subdivide the property that the detached secondary suite sat on. And in our review, we found that was an option was not available in any other jurisdiction that we looked at. And I presume that that's still the case, that you can't build a detached secondary suite and then subdivide that parcel that it sits on. But I don't know.
Whenever that's come up, I've said, well, it wouldn't change. You wouldn't be allowed to subdivide it if you wouldn't otherwise. But if you had a lot that was big enough that, right now in the zoning, you're allowed to subdivide it into 2 lots.
Right.
And you built a detached secondary suite, and then the next year you wanted to subdivide. Well, if you could subdivide before, you could subdivide now. It just.
Right. That makes sense.
You just might end up more into, like, you'd want to plan for that at the time of building the second dwelling that's going to become the first dwelling, because if you end up with things crossing property lines and whatever, you're gonna have
that was going to be the other part of that question, because as soon as you share services across a property line, it becomes a community service. And there's all kinds of ramifications in that, whether it's sewer or water. Where, to Kirsty's point, if you had a smaller lot and you had a detached secondary dwelling unit on it, but they shared a common septic system, you could probably get away with a smaller system than having to have two independent systems,
Right. So,
particularly if it's a treatment plant.
One
But-
field and two systems, but.
Yeah, well, it almost certainly have to be treatment plants so that you'd have
Yeah.
a small, a small field, but yeah.
So, but what I'm hearing is nobody seems to be concerned about the increase in density. And I mean, it is just an incremental increase anyway, because of the limits on the size of the, so I mean, insofar as we've been asked for our comments, I wonder if that's one comment we can make, that we see the increase in overall density as being incremental and should not cause council, I don't know what, not to do this. I don't think that's, there's got to be a better way of saying it. But then it does come down to water. And I mean, Salt Spring has, as I understand it, is very dry and they have real serious problems with water. So far, so good here. We have infrastructure problems, which are not supply problems. And then septic and sewer, well, again, that's infrastructure and any development, we have to take into account that the infrastructure will be adequate.
So Michael, if I'm hearing you correctly, just to clarify, you're in the table that Daniel had of, the stepped sizes. You're not picking a spot, or you're not worrying about it at all. You're basically saying that septic and water are going to be your
There'll be your limitations.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think, are we being asked to pick a spot? I mean, if I were, I think I might see what happens if we, if the spot was everything greater than 0.15 and just see how that worked out first in practice. But when you're talking about 1.15 lots, you're talking about fairly high density already anyway, so you're not going to increase the overall density of the neighborhood significantly, it seems to me.
I mean, I think one consideration too is that this would essentially be places where we already permit an attached or detached secondary suite. So they would be permitted a detached secondary suite now instead of their attached. So it wouldn't be adding to the total number of sort of secondary suites.
David, I'm going to channel Kirsty a little bit here and say, you know what? I don't think the lot size is relevant. I think go for it if you can meet the other conditions. Water, septic, neighborhood approval, all the things that the planners would look at before issuing a building permit. And that would provide adequate protection from a social and planning point of view.
Yeah, like off-street parking is, and basically the services that would be impacted by adding a residence. So I don't know how they deal, like off-street parking is going to be an issue, I think.
So we require for a secondary suite or detached, we require essentially them to provide one parking space.
Okay, great. So it's already in there, like it's not, yeah. So,
David, I have a recollection when the issue first came up about secondary suites, restricting or making sure that the lot size was big. That there was a reason for that having to do with encouraging long-term rentals over short-term. I'm not sure how that all worked, but do you recall that discussion?
I don't. No, I don't.
Okay, because it is interesting that this is on the same agenda where we're talking about short-term rentals as well, or business licenses. But
my memory of those conversations was that there was a desire to not allow them. So if you make the lot size big enough, then you won't have very many of them.
Oh, okay.
That's how I felt.
Okay, compromise then.
I mean, during that bylaw development, I think we worked with an initial recommendation that had it at 0.4 hectares, so 1 acre. And then at one point when I brought it to council, I said there shouldn't be any, or There doesn't need to be any. We have other regulations that cover
Isn't
it.
it clever how you steered us to agree with you there, Dan?
Yeah. Well, and then we did a survey and got a number of comments on, it should be 1 acre. So went back to 1 acre, and then we got comment from a number of people who said, essentially, my lot was 1 acre. It was a 1 acre lot that was done in the 60s and 70s, and it's 10 square feet less than an acre, and I'm going to get cut out because of this. And so we looked at it, and we did find a number of lots on Bowen that are like just below 1 acre. And so council then said, okay, we'll make it 9/10 of an acre.
Oh my goodness!
And I think some of
don't watch the sausage being made, right?
Yeah, some of the council thinking was they didn't know the impact of this. They didn't know, are we going to get 50 in a year? Are we going to get, whatever it may be, and thought, okay, it's better to be, a little bit safer and a little more incremental, and then review it. So some of the things from councils, okay, now we'll review it. We see it hasn't been an overwhelming, change to the fabric of Bowen.
That's much better said than how I said it. Much better.
There's an interesting piece about ramifications of development. And I'm thinking about Savory Island, where I have long time connections, and I don't know if you know the island well, but it was subdivided in the early 1900s into at least 2/3 of the island are subdivided into city-sized lots that are about 50 by 150 feet. And for decades, that was sort of a non-issue. And then in the last probably 30 or 40 years, many of those small lots have been developed. And there's no, the regional district consists of 3 staff. So there's no building department. The planning department is pretty marginal at best. There are no overt, anyway, limitations to building and development on the island, except for health. And of course, most lots are served by their own well. So, and it's interesting that on a 50 by 150 foot lot, as being able to achieve having a well and 100-foot setback to all components of your septic system can be quite challenging. And further, if a property is developed, it may effectively negate the potential for the neighboring lots to be developed at all.
Right.
I was thinking you need like a scheme so everyone agrees where septic.
Yeah.
wells are
Well,
gonna
yeah,
go.
and it's the first one in, right? And so,
Yeah.
interestingly, as we look at going to smaller and smaller lot sizes, potentially with larger service requirements and systems, there may be some of that occurs in this inadvertently, but would occur here as well.
But
In the
those are,
neighborhood,
those are appropriate limitations.
they're self-limiting in effect.
Yeah, exactly. Speaking as
There
somebody,
are places on Bowen that I know of where they're 1/4 acre lots, and yeah, it gets quite limiting trying to figure out, existing wells, existing septic fields, where new services can be placed and where building can take place.
okay, so
Right.
that's our second comment, is that while we are not concerned about the size of the lots, that is not to be interpreted as moving away in any sense from appropriate regulation of septic fields and water supply.
Right.
Parking and other ancillary planning issues. It's funny, none of this concerns me. Well, I'm stuck with a building envelope, so that's it. Also, by the
Right.
way, with a septic field in my neighbor.
Oh, yeah. And we know your neighbor.
Right up the
No,
hill.
this is confidential.
Ah.
No, just kidding. But yeah, community septic fields, I think, are, and I don't know if this would have to be something thought of at the very initial stages of subdividing into smaller lots where secondary suites are contemplated, is a community septic field, which on a per lot basis would take a lot less space, right?
Yes.
So
We now
those-
have some recent subdivisions. That's their approach, is a common septic field.
So I think we should, we should encourage that. It's sensible, and anyway.
Strata developments often do that.
Mhm.
But it's interesting that the earlier application for the rezoning, Malkin Creek, there's a couple of small parcels in that proposal.
Yeah, I was
Yeah, I
curious
mean, that's
as to
another note.
why they were not joining the King Edward Bay system, or anyway, it's not
Right.
our issue.
But yeah, it's been interesting, I think, how that 0.36 has impacted subdivisions, and that like it does shape people's decision making. Is that I want to make sure they're, there's incentive now to make each lot 0.36 hectares at least.
Yeah.
So they
Well,
can do that,
Yeah.
right?
yeah. See, I think that's an unintended consequence.
Mhm.
Should I share what I have so far?
That would be great, Steph. Thank
You
you.
managed to make something out of all this. Great.
Something.
So, David, are we sticking our necks out too much on this?
No, I mean, council wanted to hear what people had to say, and you're raising. Yeah, it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting how the council discussion goes from this. Yeah, I mean, we'll hear what everyone else says too. But for the smaller lots, there are also setback issues as well.
Oh yeah, no, I mean there's
There are multiple regulations that,
yeah,
um,
maybe put setbacks in there too, because that could be a big one. And here's a planning question, Daniel. Are you allowed to put a septic field in the setback?
Yes.
Okay, I
But-
thought you would be. It
but
wouldn't
not,
make much difference.
it has to be 10 feet from a property line, 3 meters from a
Okay,
property
so
line.
I guess it's true. It's like our setbacks don't regulate septic field
Right,
construction, so our setbacks would allow you to put a septic field in. But yeah, coastal
Okay.
health has their own.
right. But the health department has their own regs.
Yeah.
So I had included this information if we were going to make a maximum size, but maybe that doesn't need to be there now.
Yeah. And then just the other piece in terms of neighborhood approval, like currently with a development permit for a detached secondary suite, there's not a consultation piece of that permit
yeah, I was
approval.
going to ask about that, whether maybe we could just change. Oh, okay, take it out. I was going to say.
And I know like some communities
concerns.
Yeah, some communities have made, like a secondary suite or a detached secondary suite subject to like a council approval and neighborhood consultation. But it's quite like a bigger step to do that.
Well, maybe we could still say neighborhood concerns. I mean, it's quite possible that everybody in the neighborhood wants to have a secondary suite, but we just can't. It just can't be managed. I don't know.
Mhm.
I'm concerned about adding the neighborhood concern or the neighbor's concern, because then that just gives veto power to.
Yeah, and that's why I objected to the word approval, actually, because that
Yeah.
has that effect. So yeah, take it out, I think. If council decides that the neighbors have to be notified and consulted, then that's council's governance decision, I think.
And Daniel, you don't have a process for that right now anyway.
No.
Okay. Let's go to lawsuit.
Right.
So in the city, Drew, there's no requirements for neighbors to approve, is there?
No, it's baked into the zoning,
Yeah.
whether they're permitted or not. I'm not sure how that's all panning out. I see that there's some pushback in neighborhoods like Dunbar, where there's getting to be a lot of secondary suites, detached secondary suites, and people are concerned about the density. But I don't know.
Yeah, what I would be really interested in, and I don't know if there's a way of collecting this data, who occupies the secondary suites? Are they granny suites? Are they long-term rentals, which is the hope, of course, in terms of providing adequate housing? Are they Airbnbs?
Yeah, in Salt Spring, they have a big concern about them being short-term rentals, and so and I'm not sure how they certainly they limit the number of them permitted, even where you think they would be allowed. because they don't want to have a proliferation of short-term rental accommodation on the island.
Okay.
Do they have any hotels? We have a problem that nobody can stay here unless they stay in a Airbnb because there is nowhere else.
There's one or two hotel, maybe a bit grand, but
Inn.
yeah, an inn. There you go. There are two that I'm aware of.
Okay.
So we have a problem that with our tourism, if we want any tourists, we don't have anywhere for them to stay.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there's two sides to the argument. One is, yeah, have the tourists to enhance economic activity and help fund infrastructure and so on. And but then there's also the issue about accommodation for especially people who can't afford to own their own home. Have to balance that somehow.
Right.
But
And
I
know
think these comments do that in a way. So.
And I know in terms of the water concern, like I think it's Salt Spring as well, when they allowed detached secondary suites or their equivalent, they did some work of like, I mean, in essence, they almost specified lots, like they took out some of the water districts out of that permission and said, okay, you can't have it in any of these lots. And
Right.
at some point I thought about that as an avenue, and we say, okay, well, not in this water district because it has water challenges. But in January, council adopted an amendment to our building bylaw that explicitly gives the director of engineering the permission to state that a municipal service is at capacity, and we will therefore not issue building permits for it. There's potential that this would be adopted, but we would say, but in this water system, there's a known shortage of water, and we will not be issuing permits for detached secondary suites accordingly. Might be something that we would explore down the road rather than putting it in the zoning.
Although putting it in the zoning has the advantage of people being aware of it, and one might assume that they could go ahead and have, because they have a lot size that's appropriate, they might assume they could and go to the extent of designing something and applying for a building permit only to discover that they don't have the services to do it.
No, and I think it would have to be something that is pretty clear in terms of secondary suites, and would say like, okay, but in this area, we're not issuing them because of these concerns.
Well,
Right.
one of the things I like then about eliminating the minimum lot size is it does shift the emphasis to things like water and setback and where I think it more appropriately belongs. So that's good.
Right. Agreed. So, further discussion? Steph, could you read that to us now in its final version? And if you're reading, you're muted. You can read it. Uh-oh.
Oh, okay, Steph, you're breaking up. I can read it. That the Advisory Planning Commission support eliminating the minimum lot size required to allow a detached secondary suite, provided that other conditions, including water, septic, parking, and setbacks, are met.
Great.
Sounds
Do I have a mover?
I'll move.
Kirsty, seconder.
Okay, it's Martin's turn.
Okay. Martin.
Second.
Okay. All in favor? All right, we're unanimous on this.
I think this is hilarious. You need a mover and a seconder and then one more vote.
Yeah, that's it. We're down to,
Yeah.
how are we doing on that front? That's a whole other question stuff.
Well, I've approached a couple of people, but it's a tough gig.
Yeah.
You guys are just so good at it. You're doing a great job.
It's just you better take out life insurance on all of us.
Yeah.
Each of us.
Oh,
All right. Do we have
That's it.
We're back to the 2021 Island Plan.
Yeah.
All
And
right.
that's an excerpt about the circle, close the loop on your recommendations that go to council. The Smith rezoning.
Great. All right. Daniel, do you have more things? Are we going to be needing another meeting coming up here?
So I do have that, like that Smith rezoning will be coming back to you probably the next meeting.
Okay.
I don't think I have anything else at this point. We had a good council meeting on conservation development. When was that? In
A month ago, I think. Or
yeah, early February, I guess. And I have to go back to council with it before it'll come back to the APC. But so that will probably not be until.
Did I misunderstand what happened? I thought what happened was that council concluded that there was sufficient conservation issues raised in the existing bylaws, policies and procedures that they didn't need an overriding conservation development.
well, not quite.
No,
Okay.
I think I think more the takeaway I got from it was that yes, we already have, we have policies that broadly point towards conservation development. And, that's a concept that's supported by the OCP, but wanting just that guiding policy for rezonings.
Okay. Because I have to admit, I read all the comments from all the other committees and despaired.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure how they could all be accommodated. And
I think that was some of the takeaway was, okay, what we're going to do is a simpler policy that's focused on rezonings and not, it's not a policy that's going to solve every issue, but it's going to guide rezonings and provide that direction at that point.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, obviously, I'd be very curious to see what happens, what comes back. And oh my goodness, every time I think about poor Dennis and the work he did on it. Anyway. But I look forward to seeing that one.
Okay.
So should I make a motion to adjourn?
Well, in the absence of David Wrench, we'll have to look to you, Michael. Motion to adjourn.
I'll second that.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Great. Thanks, everybody. See you next
Thanks,
time.
Steph. Thanks, Dan.
Good
Thank
evening.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
So, thank you.